Welcome to Sword of Laban, a channel faithful to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Here we seek greater light and truth and have fun. If you haven't watched the first two videos in this series, click up here to watch. If you have watched them, then you know that I've made the same intro joke about my sweater twice. So to switch it up this time, I'm ditching the sweater and wearing my Christmas PJs. And it's a onesie. I know, right? Anyway, please subscribe. Let's get into it. There are three likely ways to travel from the New World to Jerusalem. First, across the Pacific. I think hugging the coastline for frequent stop-offs is more likely from a practical standpoint, rather than island hopping through the Pacific. It's hard to stock water, food, and maintenance supplies for the vast journey. Sure, God could have made food and drink appear on the boat and have given them oranges to stave off the scurvy and extra lumber for repairs when there was a problem and so forth. But that's not really in line with God's usual mode of operation, I don't think. It's better to have them travel around the rim. Now, this would have taken them past Myanmar, Burma, and Thailand, which are coastal countries that have ancient legends of a gold book and three brothers who are sons of God, and the youngest brother takes the book but promises it will return. Okay, so if you look into it, not all the details match, but maybe there's something interesting there. Maybe I'll do a future video on this. So did they stop off there and, preach along the way? This path would have also brought them through Arabia, where they could pick up frankincense and myrrh. It would have also made them approach Jerusalem from the east, as the scriptures say. Of course, measured by the shortest path, the Americas are actually west of Jerusalem. But they didn't have Google Maps, and all we and they can say is that they just came from an easterly direction as they pulled into Jerusalem. Of course, they saw his star in the east, but they also came, quote, from the east. Now, I'd already talked about seeing the star in the east in the last video, but as a reminder, and this is probably important, the scriptures don't say that the wise men followed the star to get from their country to Jerusalem. They just saw the star and then showed up in Jerusalem. So that's why I'm not attempting to map any of these paths here onto some following of some star. But only when they are in Jerusalem, then the scriptures say that the wise men saw the star again and followed it from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Path 1 is a much longer journey, but the ability to hug the coastline is a huge plus that you don't get in the Atlantic. Now, one major reason people think that the original 600 BC Lehite voyage in the reverse direction wasn't the Pacific is because the currents are apparently in the wrong direction for that voyage. I'm no oceanologist, but if that is true, well, then the currents would be favorable for this return journey. So that may be an additional reason. Okay, so number 1 is my preferred path, but I agree it could be any of these. Let's compare with the other two. First, they came from the east, which matches 1 and 3. And by the way, I tend to think that 3 was a reversal of the 600 BC voyage. Next, in Alma 63, it says, Hagoth's boats were launched into the West Sea, which may be the Pacific. Sure, he could have also made another boat and launched it into the East Sea or the Atlantic or whatever, but that would be more difficult. However, I think in the Heartland model, the West Sea is actually an inland lake, so this may not be a problem. So I'll just drop some question marks there. Next, paths 2 and 3 do work with the Heartland model. The Heartland model meaning that the Lehites were actually in what is today the United States of America. Now, all of them could work with the Mesoamerican model, which believes that the Lehites were in the Mexico area. And I mentioned this before, but I'm told that path 1 works with the ocean currents, based on the fact that I hear it wouldn't have easily worked in the reverse direction. But please comment if you know more about this. Paths 2 and 3, I'm not sure, so let's drop a question mark there. And while it's not a requirement for them to travel through Arabia, and they could have picked up their gifts anywhere, frankincense and myrrh are primarily thought of as Arabian products, so it adds likelihood to the story if we mark that down. I think also worthy of mention is the possibility that the Lehites comprise some of the ancestors of the Polynesian peoples. Not on this journey, but on other journeys. This has been suggested or said by several prophets. On the one hand, this could just be supposition. But the point is, if this is true, then it would be hard to reconcile if Hagoth and all the Nephite shipbuilding was going on in the Atlantic, right? Next, and this may be coincidental, but I'm often skeptical of coincidences in scripture, right? Nephi and Lehi's father was Helaman. When Nephi gave up the judgment seat to Cesaram so that he and Lehi could preach full-time, Nephi and Lehi remember their father's patriarchal blessing-like instruction. Now there are 7 verses of that in Helaman chapter 5. Their father first reminded them that they were named after the original 600 BC Lehi and Nephi, so that, when you remember your names, ye may remember them and their works. Second, there was language that spoke of storms to be endured and navigation across a vast gulf of misery, which mirrors the postulated voyage of the wise men via ship across an ocean. Third, his message is all about Christ, which is also the point of this postulated voyage. Fourth, he says that they shall do these things to lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, yea, which is eternal, which fadeth not away. Now treasure is exactly what the Bible calls what the wise men brought. In Matthew 2 it says, "And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh." So there's sort of this treasure language too, which is interesting. Lastly, on this topic, I'll say that, yeah, it's possible that they stopped off sooner and then followed land-based silk trade roads or other roads. But I tend to think if you've gone to the trouble to get on a boat, you should stay on the boat as long as you can. So that's why I've drawn it this way. What do you think is the most likely between these 3 paths? Pause the video and let me know below. Now Hagoth. Alma 63 is the only mention of Hagoth. It says, "In the 37th year, Hagoth went forth and built a large ship and launched it into the West Sea." And so the people sailed north. Notice how they are hugging the coastline here, right? They could have struck out straight into the Pacific, but that's probably not the way they naturally thought of voyages. Next, a bunch of people and provisions went up north, and he built other ships, and another ship sailed forth. And that's not the end of it, because in Helaman 3:10, it's talking about how a bunch of people moved way northward, an exceedingly great distance, found that timber was scarce there, and so the people south sent forth much timber by the way of shipping, so the people could build many cities. So there's a robust trade system of shipping, with boats large enough to carry a lot of people and timber and build many cities, and traveling exceedingly great distances. Now, in the first video, I said that Nephi may have commissioned Hagoth to build a boat, and someone rightly pointed out that Hagoth's work was more than 50 years before Christ, so Hagoth would be very old when Nephi began his journey. Okay, yes. In fact, in the first video, I gave a mathematical formula that gives Nephi's age, and by those assumptions, Nephi was about 3 years old when the initial Hagoth voyages are going down, and 50 years later when Nephi needs the boat, Hagoth may be 70 or older. So instead, let's just say then that Nephi commissioned like Hagoth Incorporated or Hagoth Limited, Hagoth Inc. Anyway, whether it was the very old Hagoth himself that Nephi talked to, or more likely he was gone and Hagoth's son or successors. Okay, so yes, I'll concede that Hagoth may not have been around, but saying that Hagoth was too old is actually missing the point. The point is that Nephi needs a boat, and the text happens to mention that there's this industry of large-scale boat building for transport of people and goods long distances. And it's coincidentally mentioned in the lead-up to the disappearance of these 3 prophets. All this about boats in the text just gives ample evidence that an ocean voyage is feasible, right? If we didn't have that, we'd be wondering how Nephi got back to the old world. Also, the text never says that Hagoth went north with the colonizers. It's just that he made the ships for the colonizers, so he may have stuck around. Lastly, let's go back to the old world for a minute. Isaiah chapter 60 has some really interesting things to say about the wise men and possibly the Nephites. So verse 1 here is talking about light, and then verse 2 is talking about darkness, and then verse 3, the light comes back. It seems to echo like the day-night day, which is bright as if it were one day that the Nephites observed. It also says, "Kings shall come to the brightness of thy rising," which may point both to Christ, the kings coming to Christ, and also to the star rising. Now it does say that Gentiles and also kings would come, but it doesn't say that the kings are Gentiles. Then in verse 4, it talks about thy sons coming from far. In 5, it talks about the sea. The camels from Midian, Ephah, Sheba, Kedar, Nebaioth, bringing gold and incense. It talks about clouds and doves coming to windows, which is a reference that harks back to Noah's Ark, which is a ship, of course. It talks about isles of the sea, ships of Tarshish, to bring thy sons from afar, bringing silver and gold to Jesus. Anyway, the prophecy is multivalent, and there are a lot of things going on and a lot of meanings. But several of these verses seem to talk about the wise men, and specifically about wise men possibly coming on ships. But when you get on a boat, how do you know where to go? Well, the Lord solved that question in the first 600 BC voyage. Hopefully they charged up the Liahona before they left, because you wouldn't want to be stuck out in the Pacific without your charging cord. Oh wait, I guess they couldn't have had power outlets on the boat. Well, there goes this whole theory. I guess I'll just end the video here. No, but seriously, let's trace what happened to the Liahona and see if it's plausible that Nephi might have taken it back with him. Okay, so generally, as we understand it, ancient prophets handed down a package of things from prophet to prophet. Scriptures, interpreters, the Sword of Laban, and the Liahona. Maybe other things too. In the Old World, they kept similar objects in the temple. The Ten Commandments were on stone tablets, the Urim and Thummim, Aaron's rod, some manna, Moses' staff with a snake on it, and so forth. These sacred relics were handed down from high priest to high priest. Okay, so around 600 BC, Lehi gets the Liahona, and it guides him to the New World. It's not named the Liahona at this point, right? It's just a ball. It's presumably passed down from father to son with the records. But now, Alma the Younger probably has it. Why? Well, this is a supposition, but pretty strong one. In Alma 37, it appears to be in the possession of him, and he appears to be handing it down to his son Helaman. Alma the Younger commands his son to take the records and to keep a record upon the plates of Nephi, and to take these plates of brass. Also then in verse 21, he gives the 24 plates they found. So a bunch of records. It then says these things that he's handing over were preserved for a wise purpose. If the scriptures and Liahona led them to become wise men, then that would certainly qualify as a wise purpose, and a great pun, right? But it says wise purpose 4 times in this chapter, and it connects that with one eternal round. If the Liahona were included and were to actually guide them back, that would certainly be a round. Maybe I'm reading too much into this verse, but he does seem to be driving home some kind of point. Anyway, in verse 14, it again says that these things are for a wise purpose. Notice the wording here. He's actually in the act of giving something to Nephi. He's entrusting, giving these things. Then in verse 15 and 16, he's warned to be faithful and that these things won't be taken from him, which promise, I suppose, would apply even if he were to take a long, treacherous journey in the future. Then in 18, it says again, for a 4th time, that's verse 2, 12, 14, and 18, that these things he's handing over are kept for a wise purpose. It's like he wants us to notice that point. Now in verse 21, like I said, there's those 24 plates I'm also handing over. Then he starts to talk about a stone in 23, interpreters in 24, which appeared to be different to the stone. So all these things he's handing over. And he tells them what they do and what they're for. Then in 25 to 32, he gives him the secret plans of wicked people, and he says to never reveal them, but instead to, like in verses 33 to 37, to teach the basics of the gospel. Then in 38 he says, I have somewhat to say concerning the Liahona, and he teaches a sermon on that, including teaching him on how it works in verse 38 to 46. Then the next verse, finally, the last verse in the chapter, it says, see that you take care of these sacred things. Now the way I read this chapter is that likely Alma is passing over a bunch of records and a stone and the interpreters and the Liahona, all as this sacred bundle of relics to his son Helaman, following the usual pattern of passing from father to son, from prophet to prophet, high priest to high priest, down the line, and then it must have passed 2 more generations down to Nephi. Okay, but problem 1, wasn't the Liahona in the stone box where Joseph Smith got the plates? So it had to come back to the New World, right? Well, no, I don't think it was in the box. That idea appears to have been due to a quote by Joseph Smith's sister Catherine many years later, where she said it was in the box. And problem number 2, weren't the 3 witnesses promised a view of the Liahona, along with the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the Sword of Laban? Yes, and they had it in the form of a miraculous vision. You can certainly see things in a miraculous vision that aren't physically right in front of you. Yes, an angel could have continually told Nephi where to sail, but God didn't do that on the 600 BC voyage, and it's unlikely that he would have done that on the return trip. It's likely he would have directed Nephi back in the same way the Nephites came. Thereafter, it's possible that one or more of the wise men traveled all the way home to the New World, but at least Nephi would have been mentioned again, and he wasn't. So he died there or didn't make it. Anyway, I suspect that the Liahona was simply left in the old world somewhere, perhaps buried and or in a cave, after its usefulness was up, to preserve it the way other sacred things have been preserved. Now, in conclusion, I think the most likely thing is that the wise men went over the Pacific, but around the rim, although other paths are possible. Hagoth Incorporated, 50-ish years after Hagoth built his first big boats, and the Book of Mormon text proves that large-scale and long-distance voyaging was possible. And I also think that Nephi took the Liahona and navigated using it across the whole planet to find the young Christ child. So what do you think? Leave a comment down below and I'll see you in the next video. This is Sword of Laban, out.